Welcome back to my YouTube channel, everybody. I'm joined today by Kurdish rights activist Tara Fatehi from Adelaide, Australia. And together with her today, we'll be talking about the revolts in Iran. Thanks for your time, Tara. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Would you like to introduce yourself and tell my viewers something about your background, who you are, and something of the sort?
Yeah, my name is Tara Fatehi, as you said, pronounced very well. I am a Kurdish rights activist and I've worked in the Kurdish rights space for about a decade now. I'm originally from the Kurdish regions of Iran, which we will be talking about today. And I've lived in Australia, and I currently live in Australia, and I have done so for about the last 30 years.
Okay, so let's start from the basics. So these revolts started because the morality police arrested a girl who was not wearing her hijab properly, and this girl later died in jail. Then the government said that the morality police was being disbanded, but actually that was not true. That was propaganda by the government. So can you help us understand what is going on in Iran with the morality police?
Yeah, absolutely. So the young girl who was captured by the morality police in Tehran was actually from the Kurdish regions of Iran. She was from a town called Sakaz, and she was just visiting in Tehran. Now, something that I guess many people who are not from Iran or don't understand or don't know much about Iran is that there is a very strict dress code imposed by the government, but most people don't adhere to that strict dress code. They just kind of cover their hair. But over the years, you know, Iran is known for its very vibrant fashion and very high lifestyle in terms of being very stylish and all the rest of it. So women don't usually stick to that strict. And I visited Iran. I was there about 10 to 15 years ago, and women don't really stick to that strict hijab law. They kind of just cover their hair and wear longer kind of clothes to cover their body. So in this case, the actual existence of the morality police doesn't make sense, and it doesn't make sense why Jina Amini, who everybody knows as Mahsa Amini, died that day. She was taken into custody for supposedly breaking their hijab laws, quote unquote, and then she never returned home alive. Subsequently, because of the uproar in the Kurdish regions, which then took hold all over Iran, we heard the government start to talk about maybe loosening their strict laws around the hijab laws and talking about the morality police. But at the end of the day, what ignited this revolution was that a young Kurdish woman from the Kurdish regions of Iran was visiting the capital city, and she didn't return home alive. The reasons that the government gives around the morality police, around the hijab, don't actually mean anything to the people of Iran and the people protesting on the streets. Because what this revolution is about is not just about the morality police or the hijab laws. People are protesting against this dictatorial government that has been in power for the past 43 years and has been oppressing the people of Iran. Now, Jina Amini was a Kurdish woman, and it's really important to make that distinction because these protests and this revolution started in the Kurdish region. And that is because the Kurdish people and the other nations, other indigenous nations who also live within Iran, they experience a very unique level of oppression from this government. They experience ethnic and cultural oppression that the Persians in Iran might not necessarily experience. And so when the people of Iran, in the Kurdish regions of Iran, started to revolt and uprise after the death of Jina, it was about everything that they experienced and that they have experienced under both the previous regime and this current regime. So even if the government was to get rid of completely the morality police, it wouldn't change anything because the people of Iran, but especially the people of Kurdistan, are not protesting against just the hijab.
But now we see that government is using an incredible level of violence against these revolts to stop them. They're even using sexual violence in jails. Was that expected in your opinion? And how can a government react like that against its own citizens?
Yeah, this is a very important question. And it's important because for the last 4 months, we're now in the 5th month of protests and in the 5th month of this revolution. So for the past 4 months, the world has been hearing about how this government has supposedly reacted to the revolution happening inside Iran. But what people don't understand is that the people of Iran, Iranians, Kurds, Baloch, Ahwazis, Azaris, all of the nations, indigenous nations inside Iran who have been living under and have dealt with this government have been dealing with this kind of brutal repression for 43 years. So the kinds of brutal acts that you are talking about and that the people are hearing about in the news, on their Twitter feeds, on social media, didn't just start with the death of Jina Amini. This regime, brutal repression started the day they came into power. And so for the past 43 years, that's what the people of Iran have been dealing with. And that's what this revolution is about. And that is why the only solution is for this regime to go and for secular democracy to take place.
Well, now the government is also cutting down internet connections to prevent people from accessing international media. I was wondering here, how can they be so scared of freedom of information? And how aware are the Iranian people about ways around this, such as the Tor browser, VPNs, or things of the sort?
Yeah, I think I'll start by saying, because it's been 43 years that the government has been doing this, so even the restrictions on the internet and the restrictions on information and news and connection with the outside world, even that hasn't started just with Jina's death. That is something that the regime has done for the past 43 years. Those of us like myself who have their entire family back home in Iran, we have had to deal with ways of getting around the government's restrictions on communication and the internet to the outside world in order to contact our family, just to talk to them, and in times of crisis to make sure that they're okay. And so this is something that the people of Iran have been dealing with for 43 years. So they've become very, very good at using like the TORs, the VPNs, building systems to go around the government's restrictions on the internet and other forms of communication. So the Iranians are very good at doing that, but the government has definitely ramped that up since Jina's death and since this revolution has begun. I, for one, haven't been able to speak to my family for several months now because we just can't get in contact with them. Sometimes the social media will work and sometimes it just doesn't. Through the Kurdistan Human Rights Network, we keep in touch with people on the ground to make sure that we know what's happening in real time on the ground in the Kurdish regions of Iran. And even in the last week or so, we've had difficulty getting in contact with people. So it definitely has ramped up. And that's a really good question about why this government is so afraid of freedom of information. And my question would be, well, what is it that they're trying to hide? They know that the people of Iran are revolting because they no longer want this regime in power, and they want to stop their voices from reaching the outside world. Because we know that in order for this regime to go, Western governments must stop dealing with the Islamic Republic of Iran and start delegitimizing them so that we can work towards removing them from power. And if the regime allows the people of Iran to communicate freely with the outside world, I don't think they would last very long. So I think this is a good time to say that the Western governments, and I know the Prime Minister or President of Italy has been quite strong in her words against the Iranian the Islamic Republic of Iran's regime. And I think the rest of the Western world must follow and must stop dealing with this regime and make sure that they support the people of Iran, the people on the streets who are putting their lives on the line just to bring freedom and democracy to their country.
Well, let me ask you a basic question. In many Islamic countries, ladies are not required to cover their hair. So is covering hair required by Islam or isn't it?
Yeah. I don't think I can answer this question because I'm not a Muslim, and I don't know if any Muslim can answer this question. I think this has been a debate that's been going on for thousands of years since Islam has been around. But I think this question is important because I want to reiterate that this has nothing to do with Islam and nothing to do with the hijab. What the Islamic Republic of Iran's regime has done for the past 43 years is used a religion and the laws of that religion to impose and oppress its people. Now, if you look at any religion, usually there's no kind of any kind of text or scripture around ethnic and cultural oppression. But that's what the Islamic Republic of Iran has been doing for the past 43 years. It has been severely ethnically and culturally oppressing the indigenous people of their own country. So this is beyond just Islam, it's beyond religion, and it's about a dictatorial terrorist regime that has unfortunately been allowed to stay in power, mostly by Western governments, but also by its own people, and continue to oppress its own people. So I think again, the solution is to take religion out of it and bring secular democracy to Iran.
Before we start talking about the Kurds, can you introduce the topic by telling us who the Kurds are and what the story in a nutshell is?
Yeah, so the Kurds are what some call the largest nation without a state in the whole world. We number about 50 million in population, but estimates vary depending on where you look and who you ask. And the lands of the Kurds kind of are spread across and in between the nation states of Iran, Iraq, Turkey, and Syria. So not very friendly neighborhood, but the land of the Kurdish people falls smack bang in the cross-current drawn western borders of those four countries. And in all four countries, the Kurds for hundreds of years have fought against dictatorship, against colonization, against oppression, and their struggle, which embodies the Xinjiang Azadi movement, which is the women, life, freedom slogan that you hear widely used in the Iranian Revolution and in the Revolution of Iran, comes from the Kurdish people. And that movement comes from our struggle, our decades-old struggle against oppression and colonization and patriarchy. Because we know, as the Kurds, that women's rights is human rights, and we need to liberate women in order to liberate a society. That movement was actually put into text, into theory by Abdullah Öcalan, who is the founder of the PKK, which is the militant movement against Turkey, inside Turkey. But the notion of Xinjiang Azadi has been used in Kurdish struggles for long beyond that. There are Kurdish freedom fighter movements inside Iran who were established long before the PKK and long before the movement in Turkey, who had women fighting side by side by men against the various regimes in Iran.
And what can you tell us about revolts these days in the Kurdish regions? Are they do they resemble the ones in the biggest cities? Are there striking differences? Generally speaking, what can you tell us?
Yeah, so in the Kurdish regions of Iran, as I explained in the beginning, the revolution in Iran began inside the Kurdish regions. And since the beginning of the revolution, some of the biggest uprisings that we have seen have come from inside the Kurdish regions of Iran, in the cities of Mahabat, Dranro, Sakaz, Bana, Kermashan, Sanandaj, and so many more, which I know I'm going to forget at least a few. And what we've seen is, as the revolution has moved on, the other ethnic cities like Zahedan, which is the Balochistan region of Iran, they have also come out in very strong numbers to join the revolution. So there is a bit of a difference in terms of how much the Kurdish people have revolted, because it started in the Kurdish regions. It did spread across Iran, but also there's been a difference in the reaction of the Islamic Republic regime, so that there has been a disproportionate attack and reaction to the Kurdish regions of Iran, to inside this revolution and to the uprisings and the protests. We are seeing the same thing now happen in Zahedan against the Baloch people. But the other thing is that the Islamic Republic of Iran has also used suicide drones and bombs against Kurdish opposition parties of Iran who are actually located outside of the Iranian border. So they are currently situated in the Kurdistan regional government inside Iraq. So it's across the border, outside of their territory, and it's breaking international law. And they've bombed them 3 times now and have killed young children, women. The youngest child who was killed was just 24 hours old. When the bombing happened, the mother was pregnant, and the child, they were able to bring the child into the world, but it didn't last more than 1 day. So the youngest Kurdish victim of this revolution has been just 24 hours old. And that is, if that doesn't show you the brutality of this regime and the disproportionate reaction of this regime to the Kurdish regions, I mean, I don't know what will.
Of course. And what was the condition of Kurds even before this revolt started?
Yeah, like as I explained, various regimes in Iran have always ethnically and culturally oppressed the ethnic indigenous people and the ethnic nations in Iran. Iran is a very multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious country. Most people, especially Westerners or non-Iranians, think Iran is just Persians and Iran is just Farsi-speaking people, but it's not. It is very, very diverse. And it is so, so unfortunate that the various regimes in Iran have never been able to embrace that diversity and embrace the indigenous people inside their lands, which makes the country so culturally and historically rich. Instead, they have tried to impose this kind of one nation, one language kind of notion and one identity, which has caused the indigenous ethnic groups in the country to resist against that. And the Kurds have, I think, and maybe I'm biased because I'm Kurdish, but I think the Kurds have been the strongest in their resistance against this. And they have always fought for their cultural and ethnic rights. Like Kurdish people in Iran, under both previous and this current regime, have never been allowed to teach Kurdish, their mother tongue. So I can speak Kurdish because I learnt it from my parents, but I don't know how to read and write in Kurdish because they don't allow us to teach it in school. So we are forced to learn a language which is Persian, which is not our language. And there are many, many countries in the world that have several different official languages. You know, I always bring the example of Australia, which has its Indigenous people. And they also have failed in making sure that the Indigenous languages have survived. But in Iran, it is really important that, and what people need to understand is this revolution isn't just about the hijab, and it's not just about what the people of Tehran and the big cities of Iran are experiencing. It's about much more than that. It's about making sure every individual in Iran has all of the rights and freedom of expression of their identity. And that means embracing the diversity of the country.
The government also fears that the Kurds want independence and basically to break up the nation. Is it real, or is it propaganda on their side again?
Yeah, this is the accusation of separatism, which actually started with the previous regime. So the monarchy in Iran kind of brought about this change of this notion of one nation, one language, and so the king at the time heavily repressed and resisted the ethnic nations. Obviously, the Kurds again had one of the strongest resistance to this notion because we want full expression of our identities. And so over time, the Kurds have never stopped fighting for ethnic rights, but this government is using the same accusation of separation to target the Kurds and oppress them. The notion of an independent or independence or autonomy for the Kurds the Kurds didn't just wake up one day and think, oh, it would be really nice to have our own country. If we had all of the rights to our ethnic identity, to our culture, to our language in the country of Iran or within the system of Iran, why would we ever talk about anything else? Why would this discussion of autonomy and independence come up? But the reason is that over time, because various regimes have always oppressed the Kurds simply because of their ethnicity and their identity and their language and their culture, the Kurds believe that the only way we will get our rights is by having our own self-determination. For many Kurds, independence is a dream, and it is something we hope will happen one day in the future. But we are also very pragmatic people, and we understand how the world works. So we know that an independent Kurdistan is not just going to happen tomorrow. But what the Kurds are asking for in this revolution, in the borders of Iran, is some sort of self-determination or self-autonomy. So whatever system would deliver self-autonomy and self-determination, not just for the Kurds, but like I explained, for the many different nations inside Iran who are bearing the brunt of this revolution, they need to be given their full rights of expression.
When we started talking about Kurds, you mentioned that there are Kurds, big communities of Kurds in other nations, such as Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and so on. Do Kurds in these nations face the same problems that they do in Iran with their governments?
Yes, absolutely. And some would argue even worse. We saw, I don't know how much you know or how much your listeners know about Kurdish history, but Saddam Hussein committed massive genocide against the Kurds. And he killed so many Kurds that when Saddam Hussein was removed from power and a new system was set up in Iraq, the Kurds were actually given a regional government. So today, inside the borders of Iraq, there is the Kurdish regional government. So they are a self-governing body, and they govern the Kurdish regions inside Iraq. So there's a very short history of Iraq. In Syria, we saw that when the Syrian war broke out, the Kurds fought and protected the Kurdish regions in Syria, and they protected a lot of the other minorities like the Assyrians, the Jews, the ethnic minorities, the Christians, the Syriacs, they all kind of joined forces in the YPG and the Syriac forces to protect their regions. And although Syria is, then ISIS came along and really kind of created a crisis in the region, and the Kurds were heavily attacked by ISIS and required military support from the US and the allied forces against ISIS. But today, although Syria is still a bit of a mess, the Kurds still have are still governing their own region inside Syria, which is called Rojava. So they still have their own governing rights there, and they basically just self-proclaimed that region. They are constantly receiving threats from like Islamist extremist groups, the Syrian government, or what's left of it, but also from Turkey across the border. Turkey is constantly threatening them, bombing them, sending military across the border to attack them. They're trying to convince America and other nations to let them attack that region. I think it's one of the demands on the table to allow Sweden and Finland into NATO. So they are constantly dealing with Turkey's aggression. And then inside Turkey, where you have the largest population of Kurds and probably the largest Kurdish region in all of those countries, Turkey has for a very long time heavily suppressed the Kurdish people in that region. They've criminalized the Kurdish identity, the language, everything to do with the Kurds, and it's become a two-nation state where you've got the Kurds versus the Turks, which has created a very and they've wasted billions of dollars on this so-called war on terrorism, but it's just a war on the Kurdish people, and they are still dealing with that today. So yes, Kurdish people across all of the different countries are heavily oppressed and are dealing with the same kind of oppression from their governments.
What do you think can be the outcome of these revolts? Can it be such a sort of Arab Spring that also expands to other adjacent countries?
I absolutely hope so. I do. I think it's really interesting that the Xinjiang Azadi movement has taken off in the Kurdish regions, spread throughout Iran, and is now being chanted in protests across the world. So it's a movement that every person, no matter where you live, what you believe, if you believe in human rights and you are for human rights, then you can you understand and support the Xinjiang Azadi, this women life freedom movement. And that is because this has always been a global fight. The fight against terrorism, the fight against dictatorship, the fight against Islamic extremism is a global one. We've always known that, and as the Kurdish people, we've been fighting for decades. So we have a bit of experience when it comes to fighting dictators, and this is absolutely a global fight. And I hope that it will not just free Iran, but it will also spread to countries like Afghanistan and spread and free them from this Islamic extremism, this Muslim extremism, which has taken hold via the Taliban in Afghanistan as well. There are many countries like that in the Middle East, and we hope that it will spread everywhere. And I think that that's a good question, because one thing that maybe the Westerners, Western governments, and those who are not Iranian don't understand is that the removal of the Islamic Republic regime in Iran is not just good for the Iranian people and the other nations in that region, but it's good for the whole world, because the Islamic Republic regime is one of the largest state sponsors of terrorism. Hezbollah, Hamas, you name it, they fund and arm them. And so if we remove this regime from power, we can hopefully reduce those Islamic extremist terrorist groups from the region and hopefully bring more freedom and more democracy to a region that has seen crisis and war for a very, very long time.
Do you think the West should intervene in support of the revolts, or maybe the Western intervening can make things even worse by escalating things? I don't know. What are your thoughts about this?
Yeah. No one is calling for Western intervention. We don't think that that's what's needed here. What the West can do is support the people on the streets of Iran, across all of the Iranian cities, across the Kurdish regions, across Balochistan, across Al-Ahwaz, all of these people who have united against this regime. The Western countries should support them. There are several ways they can do that. One of the ways is to cut all ties with the regime and stop dealing and trading with them. You know, there is still talk in America about the nuclear arms and the nuclear weapons deal. Like, that needs to, there is no negotiating with this regime. They must stop negotiating and stop dealing with this regime. They must cut all ties. They must remove the embassies and recall their ambassadors to their countries. And then they must take more steps to delegitimize the regime. So one of the things that the European Parliament is currently considering doing is to list the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, on the terrorist list. And that this is one of the things that Western governments can do. So there are many things that they can do, the Western governments can do to support the people of Iran, which doesn't involve intervention. And I think that's what everyone in Iran wants at the moment. Nobody is calling for Western intervention, but we think the West must support the people by continuing to delegitimize this regime.
Well, Tara, we reached the end of our discussion. That's all that I wanted to ask you. So many thanks for your time and for your very clear explanations about this very important topic. Thanks, everybody, for watching this. You're very welcome. Well, thank you for your time and for having joined me today. Thanks, everybody, for watching this, and see you all next time. Bye-bye.